Hi, I'm Steve Cohn, a whistleblower attorney and the chairman of the board of directors of the National Whistleblower Center. I'm welcoming you to this webinar held on the anniversary of President Abraham Lincoln signing the False Claims Act into law on March 2nd, 1863. False Claims Act was a visionary piece of legislation. Abraham Lincoln and the radical Republicans understood that in order to detect fraud, they had to empower insiders to step forward. And that's what they did in this law. It was visionary because they foresaw large-scale government contracting. And they foresaw the role of insiders, we now call them whistleblowers, in reporting those frauds. And today marks the 158th anniversary of that visionary law. And we are absolutely honored to have Mr. Chris Kolesnik as a guest in today's webinar. I've known Chris for many years, back in the early 1990s, when he was a staffer for Senator Charles Grassley. Bipartisan, courageous, and a defender of whistleblowers, regardless of what they blew the whistle on, Democrat, Republican, and we knew him through the FBI. He took on some of the toughest FBI cases. And I came to know Chris, and then I learned that he played an instrumental role in getting the False Claims Act amended in 1986. So to understand the history, Abraham Lincoln signed it into law on March 2nd, 1863. And it was a fantastic law. It was so good that in 1943, the corrupt contractors who were profiting from war contracts in World War II destroyed it. They amended it and rendered it toothless. And in 1986, there was a bipartisan effort. Democrats and Republicans together joined to fight fraud, primarily in defense contracting initially, but it covers all federal contracting. And they beat the contractors, they beat the special interests, they amended the law and created the most powerful and effective whistleblower law in history. It has recovered over $45 billion in whistleblower initiated cases. Whistleblowers have been awarded, corrupt contractors put out of business, people thrown into jail for their corruption. So today, Chris Kolesnik will recount the history of how those amendments were passed, how the law was modernized into the best whistleblower law in the world. And he will be interviewed by Jane Turner. And Jane was a 25-year veteran of the FBI, one of their absolute best agents who did incredible cases. She became a whistleblower. Kolesnik, when he was working for Senator Grassley, helped her with her case. And she won. She won 2 whistleblower cases against the FBI. And that's miraculous because most never win one. She won 2. And she will interview Chris and talk about the formation. So we're going to turn it over to Chris and Jane, but I just want to pause for a moment and to think back to what those senators and congressmen and President Lincoln did in 1863 when they understood the role of what we now call whistleblowers. They understood the need to incentivize and bring them forward to protect the government and the taxpayers and the people from corruption. It's my honor to introduce Jane and Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for that kind introduction. Like Steve said, my name is Jane Turner, and I am an FBI whistleblower and a whistleblower advocate. The reason I'm here today is because Chris Kolesnik and Stephen Cohn advocated my case, along with many others. They took on the FBI and other powerful federal agencies. They never blinked and never, ever surrendered. I am here today to introduce Chris Kolesnik, a real pleasure because people line up to be able to introduce this man. But I'm going to, first of all, share a few facts with you, some well known, some not known at all. As you know, the False Claims Act, FCA, also called the Lincoln Law, is an American federal law passed under the administration of President Abraham Lincoln on March 2nd, 1863, due to corruption in military spending during the Civil War. But in the massive military spending leading up to and during World War II, the U.S. Attorney General relied on criminal provisions of the law to deal with fraud, rather than using the FCA. The law was again amended in 1986, again due to issues with military spending. Under President Ronald Reagan's military buildup, reports of massive fraud among military contractors had become major news, and Congress acted to strengthen the FCA. The government has recovered more than $62 billion under the False Claims Act between 1987 and 2019. As of 2019, over 72% of all federal FCA actions were initiated by whistleblowers. Those are the facts. But a little known fact is that Chris Kolesnik is the power behind the throne, the man behind the curtain. Chris has spent 34 years as a veteran of federal government oversight. 19 of those years were as a senior counselor and director of investigations for Senator Chuck Grassley, the patron saint of whistleblowers. But even patron saints have people behind their golden veil. That happens to be Chris Kolesnik. Following his work in the Senate, Chris became executive director of the National Whistleblower Center and spent 10 years working with the Department of Interior's Office of Inspector General. He was the Associate Inspector General for External Affairs. The cases Chris had oversight, his involvement were as numerous as they were notable. Set the stage for us, Chris, back in 1981, 40 years ago, when you started working for Senator Grassley, and how you helped uncover the infamous overpriced military parts that exposed tens of billions of dollars of waste and mismanagement of taxpayer dollars.
Wow, I didn't realize it was 40 years ago. You're right, Bill. It was 39. You're right. Well, let me just say that I was not a defense staffer until I got into defense because of the profligate spending of money that Congress was providing to the Defense Department. This is the time when Ronald Reagan became president and defeated Jimmy Carter in 1980. Reagan ran on a platform of increasing the Defense Department budget by quite a substantial amount. The problem was that right after Reagan became president, we had a deep recession. And all of a sudden, the budget, now this is a little out of context because now we're talking about deficits in the trillions. But back then, they were $200 billion as far as the eye could see. 39 years ago, that was big money. So now all of a sudden, we had to figure out what can we do in order to get these deficits under control. Back then, deficits were like, before the $200 billion deficits, they were like 20, 30 billion, something like that, 40 billion at the most. So we had to do something. Now, my boss, Chuck Grassley, campaigned just like Reagan to have a huge defense budget. But all of a sudden, things changed in the real world. So we had to figure out what we were going to do. I proposed to him to have an across-the-board budget freeze that would freeze all spending, including the Defense Department budget. That didn't sit very well with Ronald Reagan, and it didn't sit very well with other Republicans who also had campaigned on big budget deficits, or defense budget increases rather. And so we proposed that in the first year. We got some Republicans to go with us, but not many. And we didn't get any Democrats either, because we were freezing social spending, Social Security increases, COLA increases for retirees, and other things like that. So at the end of that year, before Grassley went home to Christmas recess, he said, you need to find out if we can freeze the defense budget along with everything else, so we can get the rest of the Republicans behind us. And if you can't do that, if you don't think you can do that, then I need to know that too. So I said, okay. So basically it was like a month and a half that I had to figure out, okay, how am I going to find out whether you can actually freeze the defense budget without destroying the defense of our country? And one thing led to another. And without going into all the details, we figured out a way to do it. We started out on the budget committee getting a macro briefing of the defense budget before the budget committee, that would show that the more money we were putting into the defense budget, believe it or not, the less defense capability we were getting out of it. And it's because of the way the Pentagon contractors and the Pentagon brass and others do business. They game the system. And the result of that, we were on the front page of Time magazine after only a couple months.
Yeah.
Then people had a hard time really grasping the macro, very complicated budget implications of how you get less defense with more money. So we decided to switch from macro to micro. And that's when we went out, we found these little spare parts the military was purchasing to be able to show, well, if we can't explain how ridiculously expensive a fighter jet is, or a tank, let's take a little part from one of those weapons and show you how ridiculous the spending is. So we went out and we found stuff like there was a washer that was about 2 inches in diameter. And it was a steel washer. They called it a Sharepin spacer because if anybody was examining the cost, they wouldn't know that it was actually just a washer, a steel washer. And that went for $643, I think it was.
Wow.
We found a plastic stool cap that fits on the bottom of one of the legs of a stool that would go on a B-52 bomber that a navigator would sit on. And that went for $998. And we caught it before it was about to become $1,110 the next year. And
Wow.
and what we did was, for each of these things we found, $500 hammers, $7,622 coffee makers. What we did was we would get the bill of material and the bill of labor. So we would show that item by item where the money went to each of these items. They had to pay for it. They had to absorb the costs of all the vice presidents that they had, all the overhead, all the scrap and rework because the quality control was bad. Anyway, this went over the entire country like you could not believe. And everybody was absolutely ticked off. It was as if in the present day, everybody in Texas was ticked off because Ted Cruz went to Cancun. It was
Yeah.
that kind of outrage around the country. And so we all, now that got people's attention. If the macro thing didn't work, the story that was on the front cover of Time magazine, this one did. And the combination of the two, we were able to intellectually, honestly match up the micro to the macro. And within 2 years, I never thought it would ever happen. Within 2 years, the Defense Department budget was frozen in the middle of the Cold War. That's how bad it was. And everybody in the defense community was floored. And I had people coming up to me and say, okay, you beat us, because they used to tell us, if you took 1 nickel out of the Defense Department budget, the whole thing would collapse. You don't understand. It's like, no, we don't understand. Of course we don't understand. But we did it. All right. So that aside, that was in 1985. Reagan came in 1981. By 85, we had frozen the defense budget spending, and we saved hundreds of billions of dollars by doing that. And eventually, because of other things we did, we increased defense capability because we reformed the process by which they were letting weapons be produced that didn't work. And we would catch them at phoning up the test results. We fixed that. We fixed other problems like that. Now, there was one other big issue that we had a hard time getting our arms around, and that was defense fraud. What you have to understand is all those overpriced spare parts that we found, the $500 hammer, the $600 and 40-some dollar toilet seat that we later found, all of that was not fraud. It was legal. The Defense Department was allowing it because they had so much money from increasing the defense budget, they had to absorb it. They weren't producing more things, more tanks and planes and ships. They were increasing the costs. And so they were getting less and less, because of the games they would play between the contractors and Congress would let them do it, and the Pentagon, they would get less capability. So the real fraud, though, was taking place not there. It was where defense contractors were selling inferior equipment to the government, just like they did back in the Civil War with President Lincoln, where they would, instead of providing ammunition, gunpowder, like their contract said in the Civil War, they would provide sawdust, or the horses that they would provide to the government were all lame and inferior, those sorts of things. Well, now under Reagan in the 1980s, it was all inferior products, and that would be a false claim. That would be a false claim against the government. because in the contract, the government, unlike the spare parts where they would allow the cost increases, they wouldn't allow in the contracts inferior equipment, fraudulent equipment. When you claim the money from the government, the government didn't sign up for bad products. So those sorts of things were occurring left and right. And we tried, we just beat our heads against the wall to try to get the Reagan Justice Department to prosecute this fraud. We got whistleblowers left and right coming in saying, just telling their stories about the fraud that was going on. The Reagan administration would do nothing about it. So I was looking around for some reform ideas to try to get that problem under control. If the Justice Department wasn't going to do it, and they would usually use, as you said in your introduction, they would use the criminal statutes to go after the fraud. And they wouldn't do that. So along came a guy he was the guy who actually found the spare parts for us that I was describing. His name was Ernie Fitzgerald. And if Grassley was the patron saint of whistleblowers, Ernie was the godfather or the grandfather of whistleblowers, because he was a whistleblower himself under Nixon. Grassley was the chief government official in the Senate who would help. Ernie brought this idea to me about fixing the False Claims Act, and he brought me the history of it, about how Lincoln had signed this law to try to go after the fraud. And over the years, the defense contractors started to erode the effectiveness of it by getting Congress to change the law at various points, various decades along the way. The last of which was, I think, about 1945, after the Second World War. So my thought was, if the Justice Department was not going to go after these contractors and the fraud they were perpetrating, then I was going to solicit the help of the citizenry of the country and go after the contractors civilly. And that was the concept behind this. That's why it resonated with me. And then I brought it to Grassley, and I brought it to our Judiciary Committee staff. I had a list of 5 things. And I gave it to them, and they got back to me and said, well, you know, this False Claims Act thing you've got here on the list, that's actually in our jurisdiction, in our subcommittee, on the Judiciary Committee. And I said, well, great. Let's get these ideas that Ernie's bringing to us, and let's go out and try to figure out a way to really beef up the law to where it was, and maybe even make it stronger, which we were eventually able to do. So that's what happened. That was the origin of it. And I thought, never in my wildest dreams would I see a budget freeze of defense spending, ever. But it would be a frozen Texas landscape before we would ever get the False Claims Act amendments passed, which was, I thought would be even tougher. And they both happened. But the most important was the toughest one was the False Claims Amendments Act. And I can't believe to this day that it actually not only passed, it's proven to be so effective, like you said, $62 billion plus that's come in to the taxpayers. And my concern is that when Grassley retires, contractors are going to come after that bill again, after that statute, and try to tear it apart again.
And so, Chris, you're being modest again, because you not only had Ernie Fitzgerald, but you also had Tom Amley and Colin Parfit. You were very successful at finding these people who revealed sources of corruption and the overpricing. And in fact, Senator Grassley on the floor of the Senate said that your legacy will be the tens of billions of dollars that you save taxpayers, as well as your work on behalf of whistleblowers. So tell me how you got it past the FCA and utilized in that QTAM. How did you get it ushered through Congress?
What happened was I let the judiciary staff do the bill, and I would discuss it with them, you know, behind the scenes, because they had to negotiate with the Justice Department that was vehemently opposed to it. They were like, they were just totally anathema to that. We also had all the Republicans in the House and Senate, the real fervent ones, I guess I used to call them the extremists, and we had to fight them. We negotiated with Justice Department. We fought with Republican extremists in the House and Senate, and we negotiated with the Democrats in the House who had the majority there. The Republicans had it in the Senate, Grassley being a Republican. So we did that behind the scenes. In the meantime, the opponents to the False Claims Act amendments were instigating all kinds of opposition among business groups. They would send us a letter. There was one business group, one business letter rather, was signed by about 12 major business groups: National Association of Manufacturers, National NFIB, Federation of Independent Businesses, Chamber of Commerce, I believe I recall, and all the big groups, business groups, they all got on the letter and they opposed it. So one by one, not all of them at the same time, one by one, we brought each of those 12 representatives in, and they said, and we asked them, why do you oppose this? And they would say X, Y, and Z. And we would say, well, that's not in our bill. And they were ill-informed. It was like, you know, it was like the QAnon stuff now. They were just misinformation. And I know exactly who did it. He worked for a particular contractor, a defense contractor. He was given the lead in doing all this stuff. And so he was the one and so one by one, we would, each of these groups would come in, we would tell them it's not in there unless you could find otherwise. And they said no. And at some point we got them to back off of their opposition. And at the end of it, there was only one group left out of the 12. And it happened to be the guy who was instigating everything, his firm. And they, of course, he wouldn't back down, but we didn't have to care about by that time. And then we want that, all the backing off that they did to every Republican senator who had opposition to us. We made them, by the way, we made these organizations give us a letter saying we no longer have opposition to you, to your bill. And then we showed it to everybody on the Senate side, and then on the House side, all the Republicans. The Democrats didn't need to, you know, we were fighting an internal battle among Republicans, internecine. Then we began to create a solid wall of congressional support, Republican and Democrat, against the Justice Department. And we won that battle too, because by that time there was just so much support, solid support. And there were all these horror stories out there about fraud in the defense community that everybody eventually, they took their knee braces off and they could stand on their own two legs.
Yeah.
And then they stood up to the Justice Department and we got it through.
Good. Are any of those politicians still around that were so adamantly against it?
The ones, no, Strom Thurmond was one. Orrin Hatch was one. McCollum in the House was one. No, they're all gone because now, Grassley is like the president pro tem. He's like the oldest Republican there.
Yeah,
And the only guy older that's been around longer than him is Pat Leahy on the Democrat side, who was there at the time and he supported it. Everybody else is gone, basically.
right. And so what do you think is going to happen once Senator Grassley retires?
So my concern is that it's going to be gone, or it's going to be watered down like it was before. Not only did the Defense Department community, the lobbyists, the corporations come at us to weaken the law, but then after that, the medical community came after it because there were so many cases that were where there was fraud against the government in the medical community, where they were billing for Medicare and Medicaid.
Yes.
Huge money in that. They
Yes.
started to eclipse the defense industry in that regard. So there were attempts to chip away. He did not back off. He really went to bat for it. Now the Democrats who really supported it, there were two in particular. Barney Frank was one.
Mhm.
He had jurisdiction on the House side, and Howard Berman, a congressman from California, they're long gone. So what I'm worried about is that there's going to be an opportunity again on the part of defense contractors and the medical industry to come after it. But I'll tell you, that was when they were doing that, the Justice Department didn't have $62 billion in recovery. They didn't even have $1 billion at that time when there were those attacks. With that amount of money, and with this deficit and debt being so out of control, even notwithstanding the pandemic, which is making it even worse, the government is going to need money to cover their bases. And I have a hard time thinking that they're going to just lie down and let the forces that be go after it the way they did after Abraham Lincoln signed that into law.
Do you see, Chris, any current representatives or members of the Biden administration that give you hope for the future of oversight and whistleblowing?
Can you ask that again? I'm sorry.
Sure. Do you see any current representatives or members of the Biden administration that give you hope for the future of oversight?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. By now, it's sort of part of the landscape, this law and the concept of it and the effectiveness of it, to where your outliers are going to be somebody sent in after Grassley goes to torpedo the legislation. Whereas the establishment is like, no, you're not going to do that. This thing is righteous and it's effective. And it's effective not just in getting money to the government back, but because it's a deterrent. And so you've got that mindset built into the establishment now, the so-called deep state, just kidding. So that's a good sign. And that means most people who are good government oriented, and most of those people are actually Democrats. But there are a lot of us Republicans who are too. Not nearly half of us, but a good portion. With all of those people coming together, there's a good chance that they can fight that off. But what has to happen is you have to have what we call an angel. If Grassley leaves, you got to find an angel. And you got to find one in the House and the Senate, and preferably into both parties. And you have to have a lot of educating to do on the Hill. People coming into the situations where we were on our subcommittee, on our relevant committee, getting a tutorial in the history of this legislation since Abraham Lincoln and what happened to it afterwards, because it got watered down, and then why we had to resurrect it and how effective it's been. They have to proactively go out. Organizations like the National Whistleblower Center and other ones who are concerned about this, go out there, proactively proselytize. Don't have to proselytize, just educate.
Yes.
About the importance of this.
You trained young aides arriving on Capitol Hill in your day on how to conduct fair investigations. In fact, to quote you, construct a wall between campaigning and governing. In a campaign, you can knock yourself out playing politics. But once you're in government, you can only go as far in successful oversight as your credibility takes you. That's your quote. What advice would you give to this next generation of staffers looking to follow in your giant footsteps and being able to make lasting changes like you did?
Well, that was attempted back when Newt Gingrich came in 1995. Him and his band of merry Republicans came in, and they decided that they were going to, well, they created a revolution. They took over the House. The Senate was already in Republican hands, so now you had Republicans in the House and Senate majorities. The Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, Senate Majority Leader Bob Dole, and then Trent Lott after him, brought a number of us together, staffers who had oversight experience. And the idea was to teach all of the new Republican staff coming in, mainly on the House side, because they were in the wilderness for 40 years before that, 40 years, to teach them how to do proper oversight. And so yeah, there were about 10 of us. And I think only like 3 or 4 really had any experience in doing oversight, because they were never in the majority. None of the other staff were ever in the majority. A couple of prosecutor types or criminal investigators were involved, but everybody else were all so politically influenced that they really they weren't up to the challenge. But in any case, we tried to teach them the difference between credible oversight and political oversight. And you had to establish a wall between the two, like you mentioned. They could never figure it out. And there were 2 reasons. They all came from campaigns, number 1. So they didn't know anything about governing. And number 2, they were out of governing for 40 years. And they didn't understand that you can't govern like you campaign. That's the Trump administration. Everybody on their entire administration all of their governing people, the entire White House, except for some of the lawyers in there, they were all about campaigning. They didn't know, no, as soon as the campaign's over, you have to figure out how to govern and you have to be credible. They didn't
Yeah.
know that. It didn't register. So, and that's why, what I equate it to is in the newspaper industry, there's always a huge battle between the newsroom that wants to protect the integrity of their news reporting versus the publisher and the business side of the house that wants to have salacious news reporting to sell, to get more money. And they're always fighting each other. Well, you have to have that in governing. You have to have the people who want to have integrity in their product and credibility in their product to keep the political people out of it. And the political people are not just in the campaign, but they come into the Senate office, in the House office, just like in the White House. In the White House under Trump, it was all political. And you didn't have, there wasn't even tension. And if there was tension, the guys creating the tension, the backlash, they were all booted out. So it was all a political operation. Well, that's what's happening now in the Senate and the House. It happened in the House quite a while ago. But they've lost that credibility. And anytime there's a backlash among Republicans about the media, the liberal media, it's because they don't understand that the media understands this game, this game of credibility versus politics. But the Republicans don't understand that because they don't know what credibility is. So that, my hope is that if people, if you use an example like that, and there may be others, I just use the one about newspaper reporting as something very similar to governing, where they know that line between credible and integrity, credible product and integrity versus the poison that would come in to interfere with that. They want to keep it out. That's how you get it across to people in the future. They have to understand that there has to be this wall and why there has to be this wall.
Very, very good points. And Chris, I want to thank you for drafting and being a party to passing whistleblower statutes to include the False Claims Act amendments of 1986, the Whistleblower Protection Act, and the yearly anti-gag appropriation riders for federal employees. You have really been a giant in the field, and I know you're very modest, and I think people should know that, what tremendous contributions you've made. And would you like to give us any of your thoughts regarding the future of FCA work, or the future, where we're heading now?
Well, just that, and by the way, thank you for saying all those things. And you took me back on memory lane because they were some of the things I forgot I had worked on. But yeah, it's just of all those things, I don't want to diminish all of them. And I worked on them all, equally and with as much fervor as anyone could hope. It's all about doing what's right, and it's in understanding that there are enormous forces against you. But if you do the right thing, there are enough people in this town who want to do the right thing and will help. They might need a little leadership. I was not a leader at first. I was listening to people like Ernie Fitzgerald because it was 1 year into my job back in 1983 when all this stuff started coming together. And there were people who gave me good advice, good knowledge, and I learned. And I, at some point, got other people who I mentored, who were equally committed to doing the right thing. And it's just a question of trying to do the right thing. And people like me who have been through the trenches, having the experience, I could point out how all the things that we did, I could give you a roadmap of how to try to the best of my knowledge and experience, how to preserve the gains that we've made over the decades, and just hope that people will aspire to doing the same thing.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. You are a giant and a hero, and I really appreciate your time. I hope people utilize you more as we make our way forward into the future, because you are a fountain of information.
Well, thank you, Jane. And I really appreciate it. And I hope that you and others at the National Whistleblower Center, and you know, given your history with what you went through at the FBI, and how you survived and how you overcame all of that pressure that you went through, that's the kind of background you need to be able to have the resolve to get through with the kind of to mount the challenges that we have like this. And so, you know, you and I are in the same boat, and you and I are no different. You know, I happen to be at a certain place being able to do this stuff, but both of us were focused on doing the right thing. You did it, I did it to the best of my ability, and that's what it's going to take. And others at the National Whistleblower Center, especially, because they obviously have the desire to do it, to move forward and try to preserve all the gains we've made over these decades.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate your time.
All right, thanks so much, Jane. I appreciate it.
Hi, I'm John Kostiak from the National Whistleblower Center. People count on the National Whistleblower Center to fight for whistleblowers. And one of the ways we do this is to give concrete examples of whistleblowers using the preeminent whistleblower law, the False Claims Act, to stop companies from ripping off the government. Dr. Aaron Westrick blew the whistle on the sales of defective vests to police departments, saving countless lives and helping to keep the taxpayers from getting fleeced. There are countless other whistleblowers like Dr. Westrick. Over $45 billion have been recovered for taxpayers since the mid-1980s, thanks to whistleblowers using the False Claims Act. If you have witnessed fraud, we encourage you to learn more about how the law works on our website. And if you want to blow the whistle, click on our Report Fraud link to get connected to a qualified attorney. Any law that holds powerful people accountable can be expected to be attacked by special interests, and the False Claims Act is no exception. The National Whistleblower Center fights off special interests every day to protect the False Claims Act. Right now, we're working in Congress to reverse a Supreme Court ruling in favor of a corporation that had been accused of ripping off the Medicaid program. We're also working with the new administration to reverse harmful Justice Department policy of dismissing whistleblower complaints without any review on the merits. If you share our view that whistleblowers are critical to fighting corruption and safeguarding the rule of law, I encourage you to make a donation to the National Whistleblower Center. You can also come to our website and join our action network so that the US Congress and other decision makers know that we are counting on them to protect whistleblowers. Thank you for supporting whistleblowers.